So, welcome to the first episode of the Modern Alchemy Podcast. I guess some people might call this episode 0 or an introductory podcast. Essentially, what I wanted to do was give you an idea of what this podcast is about, I suppose. So, once we have several episodes out there and you discover this podcast, later on that you can come back to this podcast and at least get a general idea of what to expect from all the podcasts after this first episode here. So, and I suppose I'll use this as a video for YouTube as well. So I've noticed that I guess if you go to someone's page, you can have a sort of introductory video. So, well, let's just get into sort of what this podcast is about, and I think I'd like to give you some of my background, I guess, personally and professionally. But essentially, what is the concept of modern alchemy? And, I think for starters, I should say that I'm a huge admirer of Carl Jung's work. I'm a psychotherapist by trade, and a lot of my own personal studies in that regard has led me into really studying a lot of his work and a lot of his students' works as well. So I muted the mic there so I could cough. But a big part of Carl Jung's work was around alchemy, and he really made some, what I think are some deep and profound, interesting discoveries about what alchemy is. And I think, generally what people understand alchemy as is sort of the precursor to chemistry as we know it today. That and there's often this attitude towards alchemy and the alchemists of old that they were sort of foolish because they were trying to take all of these different elements and literally make gold. And while that may have actually been a part of that, what Jung really illuminated is that it's much deeper than that. And long story short, the way that I take it is Jung essentially discovered that alchemy, while it may have also been the precursor to chemistry, it was also the precursor to psychology as we know it today. And the reason that is because when you look at a lot of the alchemical text, in this process, in their lab of trying to make literal gold, they were often having profound personal, even spiritual experiences as they would essentially journal about their experiences with trying to make gold. And so it really sort of became this deep introspection with those alchemists. And from that, a lot of unintended insights, I guess you could say, came from that, because, if we look at it as a metaphor, we're taking all these different elements and sort of putting them in this container, and we're introducing some solvent to try to, create this concoction of whatever, and with the hope that a piece of gold would form and emerge from that. So if we take that as a metaphor, and maybe particularly from a psychological perspective, is that life is sort of made up of all these fragmented aspects, these various elements of who we are, whether it's our personality, our experiences, our environments, and all these different elements, and for better or worse too, is that the idea is that hopefully in our psychological or spiritual development, is that we begin to piece those things together. And so we have all these elements. And occasionally something is introduced, maybe some sort of experience, and maybe that experience sort of activates something deep within, our mind, our psyche, just on the inside, so to speak, that sort of serves as this catalyst. And the thing is you might call that a solvent. And so these events, whether it's some traumatic event or it maybe doesn't even have to be traumatic. Maybe it could be something beautiful. Maybe it's a wedding, and you marry the person that you believe is the love of your life, and suddenly it illuminates. And maybe not suddenly. Maybe eventually over time, say with trauma, maybe it doesn't suddenly illuminate some beauty and meaning of all the previously existing fragmented elements of your life. But the idea is that there seems to be these significant events that, maybe are, in alchemical terms, would be a solvent and illuminates the meaning, or at least the potential meaning of your life, or more meaning. And so the idea is, from a psychological perspective, is that, we're made up of all these different aspects, and we have these experiences, then we encounter something, some significant event happens. Sooner or later, we have these insights, these revelations about ourselves, our lives, that really sort of illuminate something that wasn't visible to us before, or maybe wasn't even there. And I would call that meaning. So in some sense, what modern alchemy is about is really that idea of taking these, ordinary life experiences that are often, catalyzed in some sense by the more significant events, and we sort of piece them together and realize that there's something beautiful, there's something meaningful about that the gold emerges. And so the idea is that there's gold in the chaos, in the darkness, in all the fragmented aspects of our life. The alchemists called it, one of the terms they had for it was the philosopher's stone. And so I think the metaphor really works. And to me, it makes sense why that alchemy was sort of the precursor to psychology. Because you could say that psychology, the study of psychology, and the psychotherapy that sort of operates on that field, if you will, is very much about taking life problems, people who are coming in with at least some pieces of the puzzle. They have these fragmented aspects, and however they may identify their problem or the specifics of their problem. Essentially, fundamentally, they're bringing that in and saying, here's all these pieces, and how can I put these together? And in the psychotherapeutic process, what I would say ideally happens is that the psychotherapist would introduce perspectives, and these perspectives would sort of, well, in some sense, they're maybe by design, if you will, is that they're meant to be disruptive. They're meant to sort of dissolve preconceived notions or our current understanding and perceptions of ourselves and all the aspects of ourselves, and sort of dissolves that. And so you often see in therapy is that clients will come in, here's the problem, here's what I want to fix or sort out here, and they think that they can just start right there and immediately start piecing it together, right? And much their dismay, sometimes, is that they realize that there's more to the problem than they imagine, and that's not a pleasant experience. And so, but that's sort of the solvent that sort of dissolves all these preconceived notions, or but it doesn't make them go away, because the substance is still there. But through that process, some insight emerges, some things start to come together, and what they can walk away with is something useful. Essentially, ideally, it's the gold, and so they sort of take what they might think are sort of ordinary life experiences, and sort of engage in that psychotherapeutic process, what the alchemists sort of had as the alchemical process, and walk away with this gold that emerged from that process, and it's you could say, okay, they alleviated their life problem, they sorted it out, but more importantly, I think is they walked away with an opportunity to give meaning to their experiences, and maybe particularly their experiences with suffering, and from that they are at least put in position to discover or deepen their sense of purpose with things. So, long-winded introduction into the concept of alchemy and why modern alchemy. Well, I think that in some sense, it's hard to say that any idea these days is an original idea. But Jung had this take on that I really appreciated. I can't remember the quote exactly, but it's something to the effect of, creation is introducing an ancient idea into modern times. And what I think that means is, as we evolve and society evolves, as our consciousness evolves, is that we sort of forget where we came from. We sort of forget the discoveries and you might say the original ideas, years ago, centuries ago, that set us up to evolve to the point where we're at now. And so we sort of forget where we came from. And so when you sort of, at some point in the timeline of history here to the present, it's if you sort of reach back and say, okay, let's go back and look at this ancient idea and see how it may have been obscured and forgotten about, and how there may be a negative consequence to that. And if we were to sort of go back to the fundamental notion of that idea, of that concept, say with alchemy, and introduce it into modern times, so we sort of overlay it on our modern framework of the world, or the views and the ideas of society that we have now, and life in general, is that maybe it sort of reintroduces a much-needed refresher, so to speak. And so with the idea of modern alchemy is that how can we take this ancient idea and overlap it into the modern problems? There's this idea of the what do they call it, the meaning crisis, and so I think part of fundamentally, I think a big part of what I'm trying to do here, and not just with the podcast, with all of my work in life in general, is sort of, well, let's go back to these ancient ideas and see what's sort of been cut off and disregarded. And if we were to go back and sort of remember the basics in some sense, and reapply that, refresh that idea in modern times, it really will be a refreshing view, although refreshing is probably not the best term, because it's not always pleasant to introduce a new way of viewing life in the world, but it is sort of a refresh in some sense. And so what do we do now with alchemy? Because we have a lot of incredible advances in the understanding of human nature, whether it's neuroscience, biology, evolutionary biology, and even psychology is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. It's made a lot of advancements, and even in psychology, a lot of the modern psychological models have, in my opinion, tended to sort of forget where they came from. And so this idea of, okay, let's go back and take a look and see where we may have deviated or sort of inadvertently cut ourselves off from the very source that got us to where we are now. And so a good friend of mine always talks about dance with the one that brought you. And so with the idea of modern alchemy is how can we take this ancient idea with all the problems and meaning crisis and everything that we have going on now and begin to sort of look at how life is fragmented and how all the standardized whether it's psychotherapy models, various psychological models, neuroscience, and all of this stuff, how it may be in some sense too restricted and standardized, and maybe not everything fits within those models and assessments and so forth. And so sort of taking this very, I don't want to say ambiguous, neutral, it's not that, but sort of standing on both sides in some sense of chaos and order, of the known and the unknown, of the present and the future we're moving towards, and the history of who we are and the evolution of who we are psychologically, spiritually speaking. So that's sort of a long-winded, again, introduction to the concept of modern alchemy and why this podcast. So the idea here is that I want to have interviews and dialogues. Maybe I shouldn't call it interviews, but that's what it is, I suppose. But dialogues with people from various walks of life and professions and professional fields, and really sort of engage with them in dialogues about what they do, but with the idea of the concept of modern alchemy, as I've attempted to explain here anyway. And so part of that is hopefully I'll have all kinds of different people on here, and that we can, not to think that I have some original idea here, but certainly contribute to the kinds of conversations that, while we may be having, I don't think we're having enough of, and if I could be one more person who can drive that, then I think that's meaningful for me, and essentially I think it lines up with my purpose too. So yeah, I think what we could expect is episodes that really sort of involve dialogues with people who are either doing incredible work, aiming to do incredible work. So maybe these are people sort of like myself who, I don't know, maybe some sort of up-and-comer or potential up-and-comer with ideas like this and trying to have some meaningful impact on the world, or some that are pretty well established in their professions and in their orientation and aims in life, and hopefully some of those who are well established in some of the thought leaders of the world of different sorts. And so we'll see how that goes. I would say that this is more than, well, I don't even know if it's self-help. I guess maybe you could describe this as a self-help podcast, but I really think it's more of taking an open look at the world through this concept of modern alchemy, and probably going to be a lot of psychological concepts, some philosophy mixed in there, here and there. But I think more just insights based on all of those things and where we're at in these modern times. So with that, there are probably going to be some themes that you'll hear about a lot, and maybe a big one of those is sort of the idea of the shadow, which is another Jungian idea, but essentially it's this aspect of ourselves, the negative aspect of ourself, if you will. This psychologically speaking, it's where all the sort of thoughts and feelings that we have that we find unacceptable, either to ourselves or we believe society finds unacceptable, and we sort of push those back down, and we think they go away, but the truth is they don't go away. They're hidden within ourselves, and sort of creates what's called the shadow, and the shadow is sort of responsible, if you will, for these sort of unconscious manifestations of negative, destructive, harmful behavior. And so, for instance, we might think we're some way that's very positive, and then something happens, and we snap at our spouse or something like that, and we think, I don't know what came over me. That's not really how I feel, and well, that's the shadow. You've been suppressing these thoughts that you haven't told your wife or your husband or whoever, and you've just been holding it back and not saying anything, not addressing or confronting it, and eventually it manifests, against your will, so to speak. And so, won't get too far into that right now. We'll have time for that. But the other part of that of this podcast is very, very much going to be about purpose and discovering and deepening our sense of purpose, and sort of grappling with the idea of what our calling may be, and the consequences of not pursuing that, and the struggles that come with pursuing it as well. Generally, various personal struggles that we all have, the existential struggles for sure. And another big interest of mine is sort of masculine, feminine dynamics. So you'll probably hear me get into a lot of that. And last but not least, I think is something I think is going to be a big part of this podcast is the idea of redemption, the redemptive narrative. And I've certainly I've given that notion a lot of serious thought and taken some deep dives in that. And there's some incredible thinkers, past and present, who've done some incredible work on that notion for sure. So again, not trying to do anything original here, but maybe you could say I'm pursuing my purpose and feel the call to do something like this podcast. A little bit of background with me is that I have a bit of an unconventional path in a sense. I'll give you sort of the highlights here, and I'm sure that we'll have some time to delve into more of my personal story down the road. But is that, I had what I considered, and most would probably consider, a pretty decent and normal childhood. Some aspects of that are important to say is that, I grew up in a real small kind of farm town in Mississippi, and I think the population of the town that I grew up in is about 700, and for most of that, I lived a couple of miles outside of that town and didn't really have neighbors. So just to kind of give you an idea of, I'm just, country Mississippi boy out here trying to teach people and through my own experiences how to give meaning to life and deepen their sense of purpose, which, by the way, depending on what's happening with me, you may hear that Mississippi accent come out every now and then. So that might be a good laugh if and when that happens. But part of that is if you have the personality that has a proclivity towards intellectual interest, abstract ideas, creativity at all, typically in places like where I grew up, people aren't going to understand it. It's going to be really hard for them to accept. For instance, if it's funny because what I say is if I'd used what I would, and I'm using air quotes here, a big word, which probably wasn't truly a big word, you would sort of get ridiculed and poked fun at, and all in good jest. But the thing is by default, that was you were discouraged from, being smart, being intellectual, and so it's like you don't realize it at the time, but it's this acceptance by your peers and your town is very important, and so that sort of gets suppressed in some sense, and this certainly isn't about blaming anyone in my past, whether it's just people in the town, friends, family, or even my parents, is that those sorts of things weren't encouraged too much, and I certainly wasn't encouraged to read. And so what I'm getting at is sort of the adversity with a very unconventional fragmented foundation of my life and what I'm trying to do now at this point in my life. And certainly some adversity there that I've overcome, and I would say I'm still striving to overcome in some sense. I will say that my father and I were very, very close, and he was probably the closest thing that town had ever seen to an intellectual thinker, a deep thinker. And at my teenage years, we would have a lot of what we just called deep conversations. And then at about 20 years old, tragedy struck my life when my father attempted suicide while I was there. And so while he survived the suicide attempt, he had a massive stroke, which really, for the rest of his life, which he lived for another 12 years, really severely impaired his ability to speak, as certain types of strokes often do. And I think even a big part of his personality was changed in that. And so high level here, in some sense, at 20 years old, I experienced this massive trauma that just sort of obliterated the spirit of the family, if you will. And also in some sense, I lost my father at that point. And so I went through hell in some sense, maybe even a literal sense, depending on how we want to look at it. But so I had that on top of drug addiction. And so for the next 2 years, life was not good. And in a lot of ways, I shouldn't be alive today with how terrible I was navigating life there, how poorly I was. Eventually got clean and into a 12-step recovery, and have been clean for going on 20 years now. And through that, a lot of deep psychological, personal, spiritual work. And so part of my story here is that there's sort of two lives, the first 20 years of my life and then after. And I'd like to say that that's the only hell that I've had to go through and seek redemption from, in some sense, but it's not. I say that I've been through hell a couple of times. And so we'll get into all of that at some point through these episodes and dialogues with people. So like I said, psychotherapy by trade, by background here. So that's led me into a lot of the studies that's, long story short, culminated into this podcast. And so I'll try not to click, because I know the audio editing software doesn't like those. So it makes it more work for me to do if I have to clean that up. So I think at this point I've explained about as much as I need to, and whatever gaps are in my explanation of this podcast and sort of what led up to it and my background, I'm sure that will get filled in here and there, and perhaps give you a more complete picture of that, and maybe give myself a more complete picture of that. But so here's to modern alchemy and trying to find meaning in the fragmented experiences of our life, for better or worse.